All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're cracking open a period in history that, well, it shaped one of the world's most complex and, frankly, vital documents.
We're talking about the Indian Constitution.
Exactly. We've pulled together sources focusing specifically on excerpts about its framing. And our mission, really, is to unpack those intense debates, the clashing visions, and the absolutely crucial compromises that built India, in its very earliest days as an independent nation.
Yeah, get ready to see how this foundational document was really forged in fire.
And forged in fire feels pretty accurate, doesn't it? The sources really paint a vivid picture.
Yeah.
The context in 1947, right as independence dawned, it wasn't peaceful or settled at all.
Not in the slightest.
Okay, let's jump right into that context.
Yeah.
What was the scene like for the people gathering, to write this constitution?
Well, imagine India at independence. It's vast, incredibly diverse, but also fracturing badly. August 15th, 1947, it arrived after years of serious upheaval. You had massive popular movements like Quit India, whispers of armed resistance, major uprisings like the Royal Indian Navy in 46, plus, widespread protests by workers, peasants.
And it's fascinating. The sources point out this real contrast. Those popular movements often saw incredible Hindu-Muslim unity.
They really did. People fighting side by side for independence on the ground.
But politically.
But tragically, yeah, the political negotiations between the big players, Congress, and in the Muslim League, they just kept breaking down.
Yeah.
And that failure to reconcile at the top levels, well, it led directly to the unimaginable horror of partition.
The Great Calcutta Killings in August 1946 are mentioned as the spark, right?
Yeah.
Leading to a year of just nonstop rioting.
A terrible year, a year of just escalating violence that culminated in these massacres during the population transfer itself. Millions of people trying to move between India and Pakistan, and the loss of life, the displacement, the suffering. It was on a scale that's honestly hard to grasp even now.
Yeah.
The sources even note that the images of that desolation, that destruction, they haunted the very people sitting in the Constituent Assembly. It wasn't abstract history for them. It was like the air they were breathing while they worked.
And on top of partition, you had this other huge issue. The princely states.
Right, the wild card. Nearly a third of the subcontinent was under these rulers, the Nawabs and Maharajas. They had allegiance to the British, but, a lot of internal freedom.
So when the British left,
their status just became completely ambiguous. The sources mentioned some of them having these wild dreams of independent power, suddenly thinking maybe we don't join India or Pakistan.
So picture this, a nation literally born out of partition, millions of refugees pouring across borders, hundreds of potential splinter states. How could the people in that assembly possibly debate a unified future free from those immediate, terrifying pressures?
Look, they couldn't. Not really. These outside events weren't just background noise. They fundamentally shaped the debates, the compromises, the urgency inside that hall. It influenced everything.
Okay, so who are these individuals? The ones tasked with this monumental effort. How did they actually get there?
This is key. They weren't chosen by, universal adult franchise as we know it today.
Not a direct vote.
No. The representatives were actually selected by the provincial legislatures.
Yeah.
And those legislatures themselves had been elected back in the 1945-46 provincial elections.
Ah, okay. So an indirect process.
Yeah.
And the assembly ended up being dominated by one party, didn't it?
Heavily, yeah. The Congress Party had swept those provincial elections, so they secured something like 82% of the seats in the assembly.
Wow.
The Muslim League, meanwhile, boycotted it entirely. They were focused on demanding Pakistan and, setting up their own constitution.
Right.
And the socialists were also hesitant initially. They sort of saw the assembly as maybe too tied to the old British framework.
But even within that huge Congress majority, it wasn't like they all agreed on everything.
Oh, far from it. The sources really highlight the incredible diversity within Congress itself. You had members holding really different views, some pushing socialist ideals, others, defending the interests of landlords. Some had communal leanings, others were fiercely secular.
So they had to argue it out amongst themselves, too.
Absolutely. They had to bring all that experience they'd gained during the national movement, debating and negotiating differences right into the assembly. That internal dynamic was crucial.
How long did this whole process take to hammer out this massive document?
It ran from December 1946 right through to November 1949.
So about 3 years.
Roughly 3 years. They held 11 formal sessions over 165 days, but honestly, The bulk of the work, the real heavy lifting, was done between sessions. You had committees, subcommittees constantly drafting, revising, refining.
Right.
The Constitution finally came into effect on January 26, 1950, and it became known, of course, as the longest written constitution in the world.
Which makes sense given the complexity.
Exactly. Its size and complexity are a direct reflection of India's immense scale, its diversity, and, frankly, those deep divisions we talked about.
And this wasn't all happening behind closed doors, was it? Was the public involved somehow?
Yeah, in a way that was actually quite remarkable for the time. The assembly discussions were widely reported in newspapers. They were publicly debated.
So people were following along.
Oh, yes. Criticisms and counter-criticisms in the press, they actively shaped the consensus that was emerging inside the assembly. They even formally solicited views from the public.
Really? Like what?
Well, linguistic minorities asking for protection for their languages, religious minorities demanding safeguards, Dalits calling for an end to caste oppression and demanding reservations. These public discussions, these appeals, they fed directly into the debates on the floor.
Okay, so who are the absolute crucial figures driving this process, the key players?
Well, there were many vital voices, naturally, but about six are often highlighted as being particularly central.
Okay.
You have Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, India's first prime minister. He moved that foundational objectives resolution we'll talk about, and also the resolution for the national flag.
Right.
Then there was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, sort of the Iron Man. He worked mostly behind the scenes, drafting crucial reports, and was key in reconciling different viewpoints, a real pragmatist.
Okay.
Rajendra Prasad was the president of the assembly. His role was guiding the discussions, making sure, every member had a chance to speak, steering the ship.
And then the person whose name is perhaps most synonymous with the drafting itself, B.R. Ambedkar.
Absolutely central. A brilliant lawyer, an economist, and notably a political opponent of the Congress before independence.
Right, which is interesting.
Very. But on Gandhi's advice, he was brought into the cabinet as law minister and, crucially, asked to chair the drafting committee.
Wow.
He was the one who guided the draft constitution through the assembly over those 3 years. I mean, the records fill 11 bulky volumes. He was supported by other sharp legal minds, too, like K.M. Munshi and Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer. They provided essential drafting expertise.
And it wasn't just the politicians and lawyers involved.
No. The civil service played a absolutely vital role. B.N. Rao was the constitutional advisor. He prepared all these background papers, looking at constitutions from around the world, seeing what could be learned. Mm-hmm. And then you had S.N. Mukherjee, the chief draftsman. He was the one who had the incredibly difficult job of translating all these complex ideas and compromises into clear, precise legal language. A vital skill.
Definitely. So with this diverse group meeting amidst the chaos of partition, what was their starting point? What was the big picture vision they were actually aiming for?
That vision was articulated really early on. It was in the Objectives Resolution, which Nehru moved on December 13, 1946. It really laid out the core ideals, the framework for everything that followed.
What did it actually declare? What were the key points?
Well, it proclaimed India as an independent sovereign republic. That was fundamental. It guaranteed citizens' justice, equality, and freedom. And importantly, it made a clear commitment. Adequate safeguards shall be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and depressed and other backward classes. That was baked in from the start.
In Nehru's speech introducing this resolution, it placed this moment in a grand historical context, didn't it?
He absolutely did. He consciously linked what they were doing to past struggles for rights globally. He mentioned the American Revolution, the French Revolution, even referencing the famous oath of the tennis court.
Right.
Sort of suggesting the solemnity and the historical weight of their own task, making it clear this is a big deal.
But he wasn't saying they should just copy those Western models, was he?
No, he was very clear on that point. He explicitly said, we are not going just to copy. Whatever system they created had to, quote, fit in with the temper of our people and be acceptable to them.
So learn but adapt.
Exactly. Learn from other successes, sure, and their failures too, but the final design had to be uniquely adapted for India. It couldn't just be imported wholesale.
So the goal was about fusing different ideas, but specifically for India's needs.
Precisely. The aim was to try and blend those liberal democratic principles, individual rights, freedom, with the socialist idea of economic justice, and adapt all of that for the incredibly complex reality of India at that moment.
And he addressed why the word democratic wasn't actually like front and center in the resolution itself.
Yeah, he did. He sort of felt the word republic implicitly contained the concept of democracy.
Okay.
He argued the resolution gave the content of democracy, not just political democracy, but crucially, the content of economic democracy. That was important to him.
Right.
He was also quite open about his own personal leanings. He stated he stood for socialism and hoped India would eventually move towards a socialist state. He kind of saw it as the global trend at the time.
Okay. But even with that foundational vision laid out, the assembly wasn't, a harmonious choir singing from the same hymn sheet. One of the first major debates actually challenged the assembly's very right to exist, didn't it?
That's right. And that's where you get this really sharp critique from Somnath Lahiri, who was a communist member. He saw the dark hand of British imperialism looming over everything.
He basically argued the assembly was just a British puppet show.
Pretty much, yeah. He called it British-made, working British plans. He said they were operating under the shadow of British guns, British army, their economic and financial stranglehold.
Wow, strong words.
Very strong. He felt the ultimate power still rested with the British, and he urged the assembly to just reject the whole framework and declare independence immediately, on their own terms. He even threw Sardar Patel's own words back at him, suggesting their only real freedom was to fight among ourselves.
That's a powerful accusation to level right at the start. How did someone like Nehru respond to that kind of deep skepticism?
Well, Nehru acknowledged it. He admitted the British hand in its birth and the conditions that were attached. He didn't deny that. But, he argued, the Assembly's real strength, its legitimacy, came from the will of the people. He said governments aren't just built on state papers, they are the expression of the will of the people.
Right.
They were meeting, he argued, because of the strength of the Indian masses, and their authority ultimately came from that popular will. He stressed the importance of remembering the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses.
And this wasn't just like political rhetoric either, was it? It connected back to decades of actual struggle on the ground.
Absolutely. You have to remember, the ideals they were talking about, democracy, equality, justice, these weren't new concepts just being imported. They had been central to India's own social and political struggles against oppression for generations.
Since the 19th century, really.
Yeah, from movements for social reform, challenging caste, demanding rights for women, to movements fighting for economic rights for the poor, the peasants, the marginalized. The entire national movement was fundamentally a fight for these principles.
And that made this whole process fundamentally different from earlier attempts by the British to introduce constitutional reforms, didn't it?
Hugely different. Those earlier acts, like 1909, 1919, or even the 1935 Act, they were imposed from London. They were never truly debated or formulated by Indians for Indians.
And they had limited voting rights.
Very limited franchise. Yeah, maybe 10-15% of the population at best. And critically, they always operated under colonial rule, ultimately answerable to the British governor or viceroy. Nehru's vision and the Assembly's whole purpose was to create a genuinely independent sovereign republic born from Indian deliberation. That was the key difference.
Okay, so moving from that foundational structure to the people themselves. Defining and protecting rights, especially for minorities and oppressed groups, that must have sparked some intense debate.
Oh, this was an absolute minefield. The sources make it really clear there were no easy answers here. Solutions were hammered out through what they actually call a clash of opinions. Different groups had very different ideas about who even counted as a minority and what protections they actually needed.
Let's start with maybe the most divisive issue. Separate electorates.
Hugely contentious. You had B. Pakar Bahadur from Madras arguing passionately for them back in August 1947.
What was his core argument? Why did he think they were necessary?
He argued, look, minorities exist in every country and they need some kind of political structure to live in harmony. For Muslims, specifically, he felt only separate electorates could guarantee them a real, meaningful voice and representation. His point was that non-Muslims simply couldn't fully understand their needs or choose their true representatives.
But this idea faced fierce opposition from many others in the assembly.
Fierce opposition, yeah. Many nationalists saw separate electorates as a deliberate British tactic. They often used the word poison.
Right.
A poison introduced specifically to divide communities, to sow discord, and ultimately, they believed, it paved the way for conflict and partition itself. R.V. Dulekar, for instance, directly accused the English of having played their game under the cover of safeguards.
And Sardar Patel seems to have felt particularly strongly about this issue.
He did. He famously called it a poison that has entered the body politic of our country. He believed it had fostered animosity, led directly to bloodshed and ultimately culminated in partition. His message was pretty blunt. Do you want peace in this land? If so, do away with it. He saw it as the mischief the British had left behind, and it absolutely shouldn't be perpetuated in independent India.
Govind Ballabh Pant added another crucial layer to that argument against separate electorates, didn't he?
He did. Pant argued it wasn't just bad for the nation's unity. It was actually harmful to the minorities themselves.
How so?
He called it a suicidal demand. His reasoning was that it would isolate minorities, make them vulnerable, prevent them from becoming fully integrated into the national fabric. He argued against segregating minorities in what he called an airtight compartment.
He really pushed this idea of the citizen being paramount above any kind of communal identity.
Yes, that was absolutely central to his point. He spoke of the unwholesome and to some extent degrading habit of thinking always in terms of communities and never in terms of citizens. He argued forcefully that it is the citizen that must count. It is the citizen that forms the base, as well as the summit of the social pyramid. For democracy to truly function, he believed, loyalty had to be centered exclusively around the state, not fragmented by community identities.
And it's interesting, the sources mentioned that over time, even Muslim members within the assembly shifted their stance on this.
That's right. By 1949, the sources indicate that the majority of Muslim members, including figures like Begum Aizaz Rasul, had come to agree that separate electorates weren't actually in the best interest of the minorities themselves. They felt active participation in joint electorates within the broader democratic process was the better path forward.
Okay, but beyond just religious identity, some members argue that the whole concept of minority needed to be looked at through a completely different lens.
Exactly. And that's where N.G. Ranga, who was a socialist and a prominent peasant leader, offered this really powerful reframing. While he welcomed the objectives resolution, he argued that the real minorities weren't primarily the religious groups.
Who were they then, in his view?
He said they were the poor and the downtrodden masses, the tribals, the villagers living in poverty.
Because their oppression wasn't necessarily about religion, but more about economic and social vulnerability.
Precisely. He pointed to their systematic exploitation by, merchants, moneylenders, their lack of access to education, their fundamental inability to actually exercise the legal civil rights they might have on paper because of their dire circumstances.
Right.
He famously said they needed more than just rights written down. They needed props. They need a ladder to actually be able to climb up and participate effectively in society and democracy. He also made the quite pointed observation that most assembly members, himself included perhaps, weren't actually from these masses, but were acting as their trustees, trying to voice their needs.
And the assembly did specifically take up the cause of protecting groups, like the tribals and the depressed castes, didn't they?
They did, yes. Japal Singh, who was an Adivasi himself, delivered this incredibly moving plea for the tribal communities. He described how his people had been treated shabbily, neglected for the last 6,000 years, suffering a long history of exploitation and dispossession.
He wasn't asking for separate electorates for them, though, but he still felt a specific form of protection was essential.
That's right. He argued that while tribals weren't necessarily a numerical minority in the same way, they absolutely needed specific protections to come up to the level of the general population. He made this really heartfelt plea for mutual acceptance, saying, "You have got to mix with us. We are willing to mix with you." But he was very clear. Reservation of seats in legislatures was essential for tribals to be able to represent themselves and ensure their unique voices and concerns were actually heard by others.
And then for the depressed castes, or Dalits, there was that whole complex history of Ambedkar's earlier debates with Gandhi about separate electorates before independence.
Yes. And within the assembly, members like J. Nagappa and K.J. Khandarkar really emphasized that the core issue wasn't their numbers. They were a significant portion of the population, 20-25% maybe. The issue was the devastating impact of social norms, moral values, and systematic suppression that had gone on for thousands of years. Khandarkar gave this really stark description of being suppressed to the point that neither our minds nor our bodies, and now even our hearts, work. Just utterly debilitating.
But after the horrors of partition violence, Ambedkar himself actually dropped the demand for separate electorates for this group, correct?
That's a key development, yes. He shifted his position. The assembly ultimately recommended abolishing untouchability, opening Hindu temples to all castes, and reserving seats in legislatures and jobs in government for the depressed castes. But they also recognized, as Dakshayani Valadhan, another Dalit member, powerfully argued, that laws alone weren't enough. She called for a moral safeguard, the immediate removal of our social disabilities. She also stressed that Harijans weren't a minority seeking special privileges. They were a fundamental part of the population simply seeking equality. The law was necessary, but deep social change was also vital.
And women also made their demands clear during these debates.
Yes. Hansa Mehta from Bombay was a very strong voice demanding justice for women, social, economic, and political. And she was very explicit. They were not asking for reserved seats or separate electorates.
They wanted equality, not special treatment.
Exactly. She said, "We have never asked for privileges. What they asked for was social justice, economic justice, and political justice." She emphasized that equality which alone can be the basis of mutual respect.
Okay, shifting focus now to perhaps what the sources call the most vigorously debated topic, the division of power between the central government and the provinces or states.
Oh yeah, this really got people worked up. There were really powerful arguments pushing in completely opposite directions on this one.
Nehru, for one, argued strongly for a powerful center, especially after partition.
Yes, partition significantly strengthened that view for him and many others. In a letter quoted in the sources, he argued that a weak center in the post-partition environment would be injurious to the country's interests. He believed a strong central authority was absolutely needed for maintaining peace, coordinating nationwide issues like economic planning, and presenting a unified front internationally.
And many others in the assembly echoed that sentiment.
Absolutely. Ambedkar, as we mentioned, wanted a center much stronger than the center under the Government of India Act of 1935. The recent communal violence, the chaos of partition, it pushed many to see centralization as essential to prevent further fragmentation and disorder. Gopalaswamy Iyengar declared the center should be made as strong as possible. Balakrishna Sharma argued it was vital for national well-being, for mobilizing resources effectively, for efficient administration, and crucially, for national defense.
But there was significant pushback against this, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Arguing for more power at the provincial level.
Oh, yes, definitely. K. Santhanam from Madras was a key voice articulating this counter-argument. He saw this push to just load more and more powers onto the center as a fundamental misconception.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He argued it would actually make the center ineffective, just completely overburdened. He thought transferring some functions back to the states could paradoxically make the center stronger by allowing it to focus on what it truly needed to do.
And his primary concern seemed to be financial.
Yeah.
Looking at the sources.
Exactly. That was a huge part of his argument. He warned that the proposed division of financial powers would effectively cripple the states. Why? Because most major sources of tax revenue were being reserved for the center.
Leaving the states dependent.
Right. Leaving states reliant on what he bluntly called doles, or grants from the center. He predicted this financial dependence would inevitably lead to resentment, maybe even states revolting down the line. He even suggested that if states were going to be so financially hobbled, maybe a straightforward unitary system would be better, rather than pretending to have federalism.
And others of the provinces shared those kinds of anxieties.
Many did, yeah. You had representatives from various provinces echoing these fears, arguing for fewer items on the union, and concurrent lists those areas where the center had power. They warned that excessive centralization could actually cause the center itself likely to break under the sheer weight of responsibility.
So it's this fascinating tension. On the one hand, the trauma of partition is pushing many towards centralization for stability and unity.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's a strong counter-argument that too much centralization could actually weaken the entire system by overburdening the center and alienating the provinces.
Precisely. And you see a shift here. Before partition, Congress had actually been willing to grant considerable autonomy to the provinces, partly, to try and assure the Muslim League and keep them within a united India framework.
Ah, okay.
After partition, that specific political pressure was gone, and the sheer violence and chaos pushed the sentiment strongly towards needing a powerful center to forestall chaos, maintain order, and also, importantly, to plan coordinated economic development for the whole nation. The Constitution, as it finally emerged, definitely reflects this shift with a distinct bias towards the powers of the Union government.
Okay, let's move to another topic that generated some serious heat. The language of the nation. How on earth do you choose a single language to unite a country with literally hundreds of languages and dialects?
Yeah, this was incredibly sensitive, deeply emotional. Mahatma Gandhi had an ideal, which Congress had broadly accepted by the 1930s. That ideal was Hindustani.
Which was a blend of Hindi and Urdu.
Exactly, a sort of organic fusion of Hindi and Urdu using the Devanagari or Persian script.
What made Hindustani his ideal choice?
He saw it as a popular language, not an artificial creation. It was enriched by different cultures, it was broadly understood by a large number of people across North India especially, and he hoped it could act as a bridge.
A bridge between communities.
Yeah, between Hindu and Muslim communities, and potentially even between the North and the South, fostering communication and unity.
But that composite shared vision faced some serious challenges over time.
It really did. From the late 19th century onwards, as communal tensions unfortunately grew, the languages themselves started to diverge. Hindi began to draw more heavily on Sanskrit, becoming more Sanskritized. Urdu, similarly, drew more from Persian and Arabic, becoming more Persianized.
So language became increasingly linked to religious identity.
Sadly, yes. Despite this trend, Gandhi himself held on to his faith in the possibility of a composite, shared Hindustani.
And this underlying tension, this divergence, it played out dramatically in the assembly debates, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You had figures like R.D. Dulekar, who represented the United Provinces, taking a very aggressive, almost militant stance in favor of Hindi.
What did he say?
Early on, he insisted Hindi, or rather Hindustani as he perhaps initially meant it, should be the language used for actually making the Constitution. When it was pointed out that not everyone in the assembly knew the language, he made this incredibly controversial outburst. He said members who didn't know Hindustani were not worthy to be members of the assembly and should better leave.
Wow. Which understandably caused quite a commotion.
A huge commotion, yes. And years later, in 1947, he was still pushing very hard, demanding Hindi be declared the national language, not just the official language, and attacking anyone who suggested compromise or gradualism.
So, given that kind of intensity, what was the compromise the Language Committee eventually proposed? How did they try to navigate this?
Well, they came up with a carefully worded formula. They recommended Hindi, written in the Devanagari script, as the official language of the Union. Note, official, not national.
That distinction is important.
It's very important. The plan was for a gradual transition. English would continue to be used for all official purposes for the first 15 years alongside Hindi.
Okay.
And crucially, the provinces would have the autonomy to choose their own regional language for all work within that province. The hope was that this gradual approach, the official versus national distinction, and provincial autonomy would soothe feelings and allow for adjustment.
But there was still significant fear, particularly from the non-Hindi speaking areas, especially the South, about Hindi domination. Wasn't there?
Absolutely. Deep-seated fear. Srimati G. Durgabai from Madras eloquently voiced these concerns. She explained that many non-Hindi speakers felt the strong push for Hindi was effectively an attempt to sideline other major powerful languages of India and marginalize their influence on the national culture. She noted the strength of the opposition in the South and the anxiety created by any move that seemed to erode that ideal of a composite, inclusive national culture. Even someone like her, who had actually spent years promoting Hindi in the South, was alarmed by the intensity and impatience shown by some Hindi proponents later on.
Yeah, so even that carefully crafted compromise didn't fully allay the fears.
No, not entirely. It led to calls for caution from other members. People like Sri Shankarao Deo and T.A. Ramalingam Chettiar urged patience, mutual adjustment. They stressed the need to actively address these fears, even if some felt they were unjustified, in order to build a truly united nation without creating lasting bitterness. Chettiar put it very plainly. Living together requires mutual adjustment and no question of forcing things on people.
It really sounds like this entire 3-year process was less about finding perfect, universally agreed upon answers and much more about finding a workable path through these incredibly difficult, deeply felt disagreements.
That's exactly the picture the sources paint. They underscored that the Constitution emerged through intense debate and discussion. It was a constant process of give and take, of forging a middle ground between often deeply opposed positions on almost every single major issue. Compromise wasn't a weakness, it was the essential method.
But amidst all that conflict and intense debate, were there areas where there was significant agreement, foundational principles they could coalesce around?
Yes, thankfully there were. Some absolutely fundamental principles had broad consensus, which was vital. One that really stands out, and the sources emphasize this, is the commitment to universal adult franchise.
Giving the vote to every adult Indian right from the start.
Exactly, right from day one.
Yeah.
The sources actually call this an unprecedented act of faith.
Unprecedented compared to whom or what?
Well, compared to the history of many established Western democracies like the US or the UK, in those countries, voting rights were granted very slowly, incrementally, often over decades, even centuries.
Right. Property requirements, gender restrictions.
Exactly. First, only to property-owning men, then gradually expanding to working-class men, and much, much later, usually after prolonged struggles, finally to women. India basically leapfrogged that entire gradual process and started immediately with universal adult suffrage for every citizen, regardless of property, education, caste, or gender. That was a massive, radical statement at the time.
Definitely. And secularism was another cornerstone, wasn't it? Though perhaps implemented in a uniquely Indian way.
Yes, absolutely. While the word secular wasn't initially in the preamble in a big, bold statement, it was added later, the sources explain that the principle of secularism was operationalized in a remarkably comprehensive way right from the beginning, primarily through the Fundamental Rights chapter.
How did they actually do that? What did it look like in practice in the text?
They did it by embedding specific rights. You have freedom of religion, clearly articulated, guaranteeing individuals the right to practice, profess, and even propagate their religion, subject to public order, morality, and health. You have specific cultural and educational rights guaranteed for minorities to preserve their identity, and overarching rights to equality that prohibited discrimination. The state committed to treating all religions equally. Religious groups were explicitly allowed to establish and maintain their own charitable institutions. At the same time, the state put a certain distance between itself and religion. It banned compulsory religious instruction in state-funded educational institutions and prohibited religious discrimination in government employment.
Right.
But crucially, and this is distinctively Indian perhaps, it also created the legal space for the state to intervene in religious practices for the purpose of social reform. This was the clause used, for instance, to legally abolish untouchability and later to reform personal and family laws within different religious communities.
So it wasn't a strict, absolute separation of church and state like you see in, say, the American model.
No. The sources describe the Indian model not as absolute separation, but rather as the state maintaining a judicious distance from religion. It's neither completely entangled nor completely separate. The state respects religious freedom, but also retains the right to intervene for broader social justice goals. It's a complex balance.
It truly sounds like a tapestry woven from so many different, often conflicting threads, polled and debated and argued over, and finally somehow stitched together.
It absolutely is. The Constitution was undeniably the result of negotiating many conflicting voices and competing demands. The makers, they came to the Assembly with ideals, certainly born out of the freedom struggle, but those ideals were constantly tested, reworked, reshaped by the brutal realities of the time, the context of partition, and crucially by the arguments they heard from each other across the aisle. The sources even show examples of members sometimes changing their own strongly held positions over those 3 years, precisely because they listened to others, they debated, they reacted to the tumultuous events happening right outside the assembly walls. It wasn't static. It was a dynamic, often messy, and ultimately quite a profound process of collective deliberation.
So you've taken a deep dive with us into this incredible, often tumultuous history behind the framing of the Indian Constitution. It really wasn't some quiet academic exercise happening in an ivory tower, was it?
Not at all.
It was hammered out in a time of just immense upheaval, grappling with these fundamental questions of identity, rights, power, language questions that had no easy answers then and maybe still don't now.
Mm-hmm.
It really is a testament, I think, to the power of debate, the absolute necessity of compromise, and maybe the evolution of ideas under intense pressure.
Well said.
So here's something maybe to consider as you reflect on all this. The debates we've explored today, that constant tension between a strong center and regional needs, the difficult definition of who constitutes a minority and what protections they require, that ongoing challenge of forging a unified identity in such a diverse nation, these weren't settled once and for all back in 1949, were they?
Far from it.
So how do you see these same fundamental tensions and questions continuing to play out today? How are they still shaping not just India, but perhaps other diverse nations around the world, grappling with very similar challenges in the 21st century?
That's the enduring relevance, isn't it?
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a richer, maybe more textured understanding of the complex foundations of independent India.